into a I would first like to take this opportunity to thank every one of you for making your way to be with us tonight. We really appreciate the presence and also the presence that's online. So basically, who owns South Africa? I'm catching the train as it goes because the series was started last year. It's an investigation by Open Secrets into the big players and the part that they play in South Africa's economy. And then in this series, in particular, we look into private pensions. And then who owns them. Uh, Pensions are very important. They provide that financial support after work. I was saying the other day that it's really sometimes just the only time that a lot of people get to manifest some of the dreams that they had when they were working. It's that time when you finally can buy that house. When you can build that house and even buy that dream car. So it's really a lifeline for the working class in South Africa, and not just for the people who are members of the pensions themselves, but also it extends to family. You get that financial support in the case of death. You do get that support as well to fund your education. I say this from a place of experience, and I know like many people in this room, a proud benefit of assistance, in my formative years of pension, it does contribute a lot to our upbringing. So pensions are important, and the conversation on them, and how they govern and what actually happens, behind the scenes is quite an important discussion that we need to have. And I'm very impressed by the intergenerational mix that's in the room. I think we're gonna get a good reflection, of what we think about the situation. I guess the report focuses on private pension administrators, especially private pensions. Only a small number of people access pensions or access retirement funds, simply because a lot of us cannot even afford to save for retirement. And we look at private pensions because now with GEPF, only a few people that work for government have access to that. And then there's a rest of people that are outside of that circle, which is bigger. The people who benefit from GEPF are smaller than people who are outside of that. And I guess one of the reasons, hence, the spotlight is on private pensions and not necessarily the GEPF, but we do touch on it later in the report. The report also focuses on private pensions administrators, but it's also anchored around, the historical conceptualization of pensions. And my colleague Dr. is going to speak about that later. And it also covers the nature of pensions during apartheid, 1960s and 70s, when Black people were entering the formal work sector, and like some were left behind because they were in the informal sector when the Pension Fund Act was introduced. And you will realize, how some of that actually morphed in what we have today as the unpaid benefits crisis that Comrade Sydney is going to speak about. There's that pattern essentially that starts from that historical context. When these big corporations landed at the shore, on our shores, and then it transitioned into apartheid and then post-apartheid. But really, sometimes when you look at it different eyes, it's just the same old thing. The report also looks at the ownership structure of pensions funds. I think that's this part that Michael's going to speak more about how much the fund owners, it's going to speak about the ownership structure of these funds. They're big, but who's the, how much do they have and how much influence do they actually have? Influence also on the economy and not just influence in the corporation itself. We're also going to speak about the political connections that are you going to find some very interesting and some very obvious. You know, there's also that interwovenness of certain individuals, you know, who moonlight as pension fund administrators. Sometimes you find them as asset fund managers. Sometimes you find them as political elites. So there is that network that's really explored there. And then lastly, we're going to look at, I mean, although we look at private pensions, like I said, we do look a little bit into the GPF. We look at the asset manager of GPF, which is the PIC. We scrutinize its commitment and investment to the just transition. So that's pretty much the sort of layout of the report. Without wasting time, I'm going to introduce the panel. The bios that I have are very short. I apologize, but this is just in the interest of time. I promise their resumes are very colorful. Michael is the head of investigations unit at Open Secrets and the lead author of the report. That's Michael. And then immediately next to me is Cherise. She's an investigator at Open Secrets and also author of the report. And I also have Sydney, who has a long history in the labor movement, from Chiwisa to Kawo, where he now works and supports and coordinates the activities of the UBC. As you were working in, I think you were given a survey. If you could just please help us to fill that survey and then return it to the registration box just outside. And quickly, we're going to do a poll. I don't know if it's up because I can't see the screen. So, where are South Africans investing their pensions? Wrong answers only. The first one is under the mattress. It's not gaining interest there, but it's safe. Number 2, it's Timu or Temu. that one. That's where the pension money is going. See the Forex guys on Instagram. I would say this one. And then the last one, it's the lottery. I mean, if you're putting it there, you're gambling because there's comrades that are always taking it out. We shall not mention names. I just also say thank you once again for joining us. In terms of simple rules of engagement, let's respect the space. Let's respect what colleagues and comrades have prepared to share with us today, and lend them an ear. In terms of the program, so I've just given a synopsis of the report, but I'm going to be posing a few questions to colleagues who've joined me here, and then we'll take Q&A questions after that. So I think we can get started. So I'll ask Mike the first question, and I mean it's a broad question, but I think it will help us just to unravel what's in the report essentially. So what does an exploration of pension fund reveal to us, about South Africa's economy? Who are the biggest players? I mean, essentially, what did you find?
Thanks very much, Letlokanolo, and also my greetings to everyone here this evening. Thank you so much for coming out on, I think, what is nearly the shortest day of the year. It was the solstice. It's cold, it's dark, so we really appreciate you coming out in person to have this discussion. Letlokanolo, like you said, really just maybe to frame the discussion, there's so much to talk about when it comes to pension funds, their administration, their governance, and their management. And we can get into a few different things, but I thought what might be helpful is just to put some framing things right at the front. Some of the things that we've looked at in the reports and that we think are important and help us to kind of, I suppose, position ourselves in the conversation. And the first one is to say that in every single instance, this is the 4th volume of the Who Owns South Africa series. We've looked at the system, we've looked at private healthcare, we've looked at private telephony, now private pensions. And in each of those reports, there's always a couple of things that really reveals a new way of looking at inequality in South Africa, or it presents the inequality problem in South Africa in a slightly different way. And I think when it comes to private pensions, one of the things that really jumps out, Letlokanolo's already spoken about it, 2/3 of South Africans don't have access to formal financial savings outside of what might be available via the state, right? So if you look at pensioners outside of the old age grant, very few people have access to formal financial savings. And even those who do, there was a survey done recently, no one feels ready for retirement. It's like 6% of South Africans say, like, I'm ready, right? And so the financial sector responds to this by saying something that probably everyone's heard about, which is we have a poor savings culture in South Africa, right? Which is a fairly simplistic response to what's clearly a structural problem in our economy, and the lack of access to economic opportunities. But what I wanted to kind of point out, and I think it's where the really interesting discussion starts, is that so we have very few people who have access to a pension, and yet we have 6 trillion rand in pension fund assets in South Africa. It's about 80% of South Africa's GDP, and that's significantly higher as a proportion of the economy than many wealthy countries. It's higher than most OECD countries, higher than places like France. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. But I think what it reveals is that it's so important to talk about pensions because it's about, on the one hand, individual rights, the individual rights of pension fund beneficiaries and how they get treated by the system. And I think Sydney's going to speak about this quite a lot, but it's really a gross injustice that there's more than 4 million pensioners and pension fund members that are owed 51 billion rand in South Africa that remain unpaid to them. And yet on the other side of it, in terms of questions of inequality, how the 6 trillion rand in pension fund assets are invested is really crucial from a structural perspective, right? Because that is a massive pool of capital in a country where we're constantly speaking about the fact that we don't have enough money, right? But there's this kind of huge pool of assets. And I think we're going to speak a little bit later about issues around financialization and where that money ends up going. The last thing I'll say just on this question about positioning ourselves is, in the report, we focused on 4 private pension fund administrators. That's Sanlam, Old Mutual, Alex Forbes, and Liberty. I think most people in this room would have heard those names. Most of them are really giants in South Africa's financial sector. They're also, of course, multi-purpose firms, right? They're not only pension fund administrators, but we speak about them because they're responsible for around about 2,500 pension funds in South Africa. And they're, outsized players in that regard. If you look at pension fund assets and other financial assets, those 4 companies alone have about 4.5 trillion rand in assets under management. So they're very big players in our economy. And of course, the decisions that they make, have an impact on us. And then lastly, Letlokonola said, we're looking at the private sector. So why are we talking about the PIC? Anyone who's looked at any of the other Who Owns South Africa reports so far, you can't not talk about the PIC, because when you talk about who owns South Africa, in many ways, it is the PIC. The PIC is either the largest or second largest holder of shareholder or owner of almost all major companies in South Africa's economy. And so how it conducts itself is also hugely important. And Sharice is going to speak to that a little bit later. But I'll stop there and we can get into the weeds and the details a little more as the conversation goes on.
Thank you so much, Mike, and also just for highlighting that 6 trillion is such a big number that I actually even forgot it. It's like how it looks. It's big of a figure. I think we're just going to touch a bit on the PIC. It's on the news for all the wrong reasons and like for quite a while. At the top of my head, I'm remembering something that I read. I think there's an SIU investigation into the PIC and something about them having loaned money to a company that bought, I think, shares in Lansega Airport, something like that. And now it's very difficult to get the money, and the chairperson of the PIC is in trouble for that. And another one that I also found strange that I saw, it's a lawsuit against Musa Kaula, the blogger. The Patrick Lamine, I think, is pursuing something that Musa Kaula had said. If anyone knows, please tell me what he had said, because I tried to look, I didn't find. So there's quite a controversy around the PIC, really. They've got so much money, and then there's this that's happening on the side. But Cherise, just a question for you is then, like, what does the report, reveal about the PIC's governance? What did you find, about the PIC when conducting this investigation?
Thank you, and greetings, everyone. So as Michael just mentioned, it would be impossible to talk about ownership and pensions in South Africa without discussing the PIC because they are one of the biggest economic actors on the continent. They have the largest shareholding in the JSC and they have um, really large shares in Old Mutual and Sanlam. And what the report talks about is that the PIC has a very big issue with governance or a failure of governance rather. There was a commission of inquiry that was established in 2018 by Cyril Ramaphosa to look into the dealings of the PIC. And what they found was that there was really a lack of oversight and a lot of executive board members reaching their fiduciary duty like time and again to favor political elites. And the report talks about this in two ways. The first instance was the 4.3 billion rand investment into Sekunjalo Investments to a company called IO Technology, owned by Iqbal Survey, as well as the Daybreak Farm scandal. So the Daybreak Farms, it was a project that was based in Mpumalanga, and money was being invested in it over a period of 10 years. But around last year in May, they found that actually there was no return on investment. Um, Around 350,000 of the chickens had no food to eat, and the chickens actually resorted to cannibalism. They were eating each other. A lot of the farm workers had been laid off. So I think the broader concern about this is like there's such weak governance and oversight for like such a large institution, and it creates really big systemic risks for the economy. Um, but it also shows in the way that like you see it like at the end of last year, the PIC had submitted documents to Parliament, and it said that it was still owed around 69 billion rand in loans, and half of those loans were impaired, which ultimately affected workers' pensions because 3.6 billion rands of the workers' pension money was erased. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. I also saw something recently about like I think it was 100 trillion of money like that the PIC misplaced. They had said that they made like a zero interest on it, so nothing happened. So even the capital disappeared. So it's really crazy what happens there. Sydney, I'm just going to turn to you quickly, just to speak to us about the unpaid benefits campaign. I mean, it works tirelessly to try and address the injustice of the unpaid benefits. Like I said in the report, we really try to highlight the genesis of the issue of pensions in South Africa and also throughout apartheid and also what we have now. So what would you say are the causes of the unpaid benefits crisis? Like how did we get here?
Yeah, no, thanks, Asli Tlogonolo. Maybe I should start by saying that as the UPC, from that we felt it was important that we go down to the people on the ground, where we find that when you look at the report around unpaid and unpaid benefits, you'll find that there is more than 4 million people owed
Mm.
in terms of unclaimed benefits or unclaimed funds. And those funds have doubled from when we started the campaign from 41 billion to 80 billion monies that are sitting in unclaimed benefits. And this process that was adopted by fund administrators, that they will institute tracing agencies that will then of sectors maybe go into the bargaining councils and so on. That process was not actually reaching our people on the ground. It was only serving the interest of the tracing agencies. Because still what we find is that there was a mushrooming of tracing agencies and they were charging our people a lot of money in the process. People were paying a lot of money but not getting those unpaid benefits. That is where we came in as the unpaid benefits campaign to say maybe it's important as former workers, as former activists, that we need to intervene in this space and try to offer this service free of charge. Now, we were not aware that by doing that, we are waging a war against the fund administrators, because the first reaction we got was, who are we? Why don't we register ourselves as tracing agencies so that maybe we can benefit from the admin fee that is paid to? We said, no, we are very much aware that there are tracing agencies and they are stealing money from our people. We want to intervene because we are on the ground and the people are on the ground. We want to offer them this service free of charge in terms of the process. But what has happened is that we have met much pushback from the fund administrator. At some point, we've had to march to Alexander Fox just to demand that they listen to our case, nothing else. To say that, look, these are the number of people that we have come to in contact with who are claiming that they were not unpaid. Please just look in terms of your records as to say you can't find these people. But then they realized that, look, we're going now deeper into the conspiracy. There is a conspiracy, in fact, that is being perpetuated by the fund administrators, which is that of destroying records. Workers' records are being destroyed in the name of archives. There is this rule that says if records have stayed in our system for more than 5 years, we're going to erase those records and use the rule that says you can only keep records for 5 years. And that is a problem that we are facing. That is like a pushback towards the UPC. And also, what we see now, we are seeing fund administrators being hostile against the UPC, even where we can even provide proof to say we've got proof that these workers were part of a pension fund or a provident fund, and you as NBC or Alexander Forbes or Sanlam were administrating these funds. And therefore, you can't say you can't find these people when we can show you a proof, a benefit statement with your logo that you say these people are not. So it must shows that this argument you are making that this deliberate destroying of records is continuing. And this is the space that we are operating under now. We are at war with the fund administrators.
Yeah. Just as a follow-up question, when you said when you started, it was around 41 billion and it's now 88 billion. Is it because of the campaign and more people claiming? How did we get to that number?
Well, the money is generating interest where it's sitting. It's generating interest, and as it generates interest, at the time when we started the campaign in 2016, it was at 41 billion, 41 point something billion. And as we were checking, the last time we checked was in 2022, it has generated interest beyond 80 billion, just making profits for the fund administrators. And we know most the fund administrators are making profit because they charge a fee for administering that unclaimed benefit. So this also, what is also another problem that we have discovered is that the FSCA, which is the authority, government authority that was supposed to level the playing field in terms of transparency with the fund administrators, and fund administrators complying with their code of conduct to say that if a person has invested, that person must be paid their returns at the end of the relationship. Many fund administrators don't do that, and what we've asked the FSCA to do is that the FSCA must put pressure on the fund administrators to follow the rules and to follow the act itself. But since we have had this engagement with the FSCA, we don't want to speak negative about the FSCA because maybe some of them are part of this meeting. But we have not seen any kind of change from the attitude that the fund administrators are having. And hence, that creates a problem for us because the FSCA is the authority over the fund administrators. It's supposed to put its feet down so that the fund administrators comply, but no, there's no help from that side.
Yeah, but I mean, just quickly then, I mean, is there something we can do, about this crisis? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think in the tradition of us as South Africans, we must mobilize as many, because you see, this issue does not affect the former workers. It also affects their children, their grandchildren, and their wives. There are women out there who are running office to office, trying to claim the unpaid benefits of their late spouse. And to date, they can't find any help. So what we're calling for, we're calling for a mass action. In each and every communities, we must organize our people. We must start confronting these fund administrators and exposing them. Because what is happening is still thuggery, and they are stealing money from the poor.
Yeah, thanks so much, comrade. I guess, Michael, just to turn to you, I mean, a golden thread running through the WOSA series essentially is financialization. How does this issue show itself in pension funds in South Africa? I know in the report we mentioned that the money that's in these assets managing companies could have been used for like infrastructure, some of the things that we want to do, and also contribute to our investment to the just energy transition. So how does the issue of financialization show itself in pension funds, and how that money is invested essentially?
I'm going to answer that question. But before I do, can I just say one thing in addition to what Sydney was saying? Because I think it really helps illustrate the problem, which is that to get a sense about how the regulator has failed to really hold these pension fund administrators to account. After 2007, pension fund administration companies went through a mass cancellation project of pension funds due to having a lot of dormant funds on their books. Liberty, for one, cancelled thousands and thousands of pension funds unlawfully. And then turns out that they're like, oh, we're so sorry, we didn't realize that they're full of money that's owed to people. The Financial Sector Conduct Authority never held them to account for that. It was essentially, I was like, well, you made a mistake, you can go back to court and have them reinstated. But it kind of goes to show, especially prior to the current iteration of the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, for decades, regulators have let these pension fund companies get away with that type of conduct. There's been really no energy in kind of holding them to account. And we'll speak a little bit later about the revolving door between those companies and the regulators, which goes to this problem. But back to your question, which is about financialization, which is also important. We spoke about this quite a lot. I think it's useful to see this volume of Who in South Africa along with the one on private health. And in private health, we spoke about this idea about healthcare for so long seen as essentially a social service, and how healthcare has been transformed in the last decades into, oh wow, a really wonderful opportunity for investment, right? This is a financial product now that you can access funds from. In terms of pension funds, the way that financialization, I think, is increasingly important to look at is, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's how pension fund money is invested. So traditionally, pension funds were viewed as what was often referred to as patient capital, right? It wasn't money that was in a rush. By definition, pension funds are there for the long term, and they're supposed to be governed in the long-term interests of the fund. And as a result of that, the idea was that pension fund money was a really great source of investment for all the boring things that are really crucial to the long-term growth of a country and an economy, right? You can access, hopefully, some of that 6 trillion rand in pension fund assets to invest in energy, to invest in the just energy transition that everyone keeps telling us that there's not enough money for. Investing in South African businesses, in factories, in roads, in those things that are long-term for growth. But unfortunately, like so many parts of the economy, and this is not just true in South Africa, this is of course true across the world, that money increasingly is chasing short-term returns. It is plowed into financial markets and financial products. Financial companies in South Africa, including the pension fund administrators, really lobbied our government very hard to allow them to take more pension money outside of the country, to raise the limit to 45%. If you take that figure, I mean, theoretically, that allows for a 2.5 trillion rand outflow of money from this country. And that is money that is then not being reinvested into productive growth in South Africa. Now, we have to stop there and also say, well, then it becomes a slightly complicated conversation, because the financial services companies will turn around and say, well, no, that's because of corruption in South Africa, right? We don't invest here sufficiently in those long-term things because we have a corruption problem. And there is an element of truth that we should speak about there. If you track how much of South Africa's money was invested in those kinds of long-term projects, it's no surprise that it plummeted after 2014. The latter period of state capture was particularly bad for this, and that money left. But there is another side to the equation, and that equation is the fact that the asset managers and the financial services companies, their interests lie in the pursuit of short-term growth, and that impacts how they invest. I want to just say one last thing here, because it also goes to something that Sydney was saying, and it's a slightly boring technical legal point, but it's actually very important for the world of pensions. We've been speaking today about Alex Forbes, NBC, Sanlam, companies like that. They're the pension fund administrators, right? So all they're really supposed to do is the day-to-day business of actually administering a pension fund. They're supposed to collect benefits. They're supposed to keep proper records, which for decades they didn't do. They're not, theoretically, in terms of the law, supposed to be the trustees that sit on the pension fund that are supposed to make the decisions for the long-term health of the fund. And pension funds are unique in this way. The law envisions pension funds to have independent trustees, and those independent trustees are supposed to make decisions of the fund in the long-term interests of the fund, not only in the short term. But what has happened progressively over many years in South Africa is that very, very often it is the large companies who are administering the pension funds who are being given permission to appoint their employees as trustees of those funds. And Treasury itself has acknowledged that this is a massive potential conflict of interest, because those employees are there purportedly to serve the interests of the fund, but they're also representing the interests of the financial corporation administering them. And those two things do not always match up. The problem at the moment is that, as with many things, Treasury have noted it's a problem, but as Sydney was saying, very little has been done to address those conflicts of interest that are a real problem in the industry.
Thank you so much, Michael. Did you say pensions were patient capital? Yeah, so they were not really conceptualized in how we understand them today. And I guess Ntokozo will help us, really to understand that. So a question to you, Ntokozo, on the floor. In your chapter in the report, you look at the longer history of pensions, social welfare, and the conquest in South Africa. What can we learn from that history about the crisis that we have today?
Hi everyone, my name is Ndogozo. I was also one of the drafters of the report. I think what lessons we can draw from history are that, and some of the speakers have already spoken to this, is that for as long as state and corporate interests remain coupled together, economic insecurity will remain a source of profit for a very few elite. And I think there's no better place to start really with the first corporation in South Africa. And this is with the arrival of the Dutch in the Cape. So the VOC operated under a royal charter. It had sort of quasi-governmental authority, and one of the first things that it did was establish a poverty alleviation fund. The VOC entrusted the Dutch Reformed Church to administer this fund, and what the VOC did at the time was create an economic stratum under which this poverty alleviation fund would be administered. So what you see already in the 17th century is this inequality in the distribution of social security taking place. When the British take over the Cape in the early 19th century, these divisions calcify along racial lines. What the British do is they import a set of sensibilities that prevailed in Britain that made a moral distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. And very often this meant that black people were not considered deserving of social security mechanisms. So I thought it was interesting in doing some of this research. I found that Old Mutual's old slogan, I'm not sure if it's still the slogan, but it's something like a certain friend for uncertain times, which is a really nice euphemism, because certain friend obviously meant a certain friend with certain means, and that person with certain means was invariably white, you know. The British also felt that the alleviation of poverty was not for the government to intervene in, you know. This was a private domestic affair, you know, and they thought it had to do with a certain moral underdevelopment of social classes, in particular poor Afrikaners and black people. But Old Mutual really comes up in the context of these conditions. They start as a mutual aid society, and you can contrast that with Sanlam, which really comes out of the attitudes that prevailed in the old Boer republics. In the Boer republics, they actually legislated state responsibility for welfare. And the Dutch, who had worked as civil servants in the Boer republics, had practical knowledge of how social security operated under the leadership of Bismarck. So you had this really sophisticated proto-modern social security system that allowed for things like insurance for disability, insurance for hazardous work. And it's because of this that Sanlam becomes the first company in South Africa to provide for disability insurance and income protection. In the 20th century, I mean, the establishment of both Sanlam and Old Mutual are indexed by two events, the Anglo-Boer War and the Great Depression. And the state in the early 20th century senses this as a crisis for the status of the notion that white people are inherently superior. There's a commission of inquiry that it's called the Carnegie Commission of Inquiry that's investigating this poor white problem. And what happens in the early 20th century is that the welfare state explodes. You have old age pensions, unemployment pensions, but much to the exclusion of black Africans. Under apartheid, you have this welfare state again expanding now to include other racial groups. But it's not because the apartheid government believes this to be the right thing to do. It's because they want to guarantee their own political stability. And to garner political legitimacy within the homelands, they realize that they need to give black people crumbs, you know. So this kind of trend of the exclusion of black people from these mechanisms continues well into the 60s and 70s. You have trade unions also making the demand for retirement protection, but again, they do not receive the same coverage as white workers, and because of this as well, many workers in the informal economy, in particular agricultural workers, domestic workers, are excluded from consideration. By the time we enter the post-94 constitutional dispensation, really the ANC inherits a fragmented system of welfare where you have a homeland welfare system with 14 departments. All of them are charged with, dishing out welfare to different ethnic groups, different population groups. And I guess the task after 94 has been to try to harmonize this process. But if the question we're preoccupied with here is really what is to be done, I think as the speakers have all touched on it, it will be to re-examine the relationship between the state and corporations.
Thank you very much, Dogozo, for your contribution. Just to get back to the PIC, it's the largest asset manager on the continent. Just to get a sense of what's really going on in there, how much money does it manage? Is it managing this money in a way that's consistent with South Africa's climate policies?
So the PIC manages just under 3 trillion rand. I think the figure is 2.7 trillion rand to be exact. So it's the custodian of this enormous pool of worker capital. The goal should not just be like return on investment. It should be investing this money in a sustainable way and in a way that's aligned with developmental objectives, such as the just energy transition. But the PIC does not do this. It has heavy investments in oil and gas companies. I think it's invested around 125 billion rand in companies like Sasol, Tungela Resources, and Exaro. You would think that it would use its shareholder value or its position to push these major emitters towards stronger climate action, but it does not, and it also doesn't have a binding policy with the just energy transition. Pension money should definitely not be fueling the climate crisis. And I think there is someone from Fossil Free South Africa, Sam Bovim, who will speak a bit about this just now as well.
Thank you so much. So there is a critique then that criticizing the PIC's commitment and lack of investment into the just transition, essentially, what she is saying. I guess a question for you, Sam, then is why is the PIC still so heavily invested in fossil fuels? What can and can't we do about this? I'm just trying to understand if there is legislation that can govern what they can do with the funds.
Thanks. I'm Sam. I'm from Fossil Free South Africa, and we are kind of one of Open Secret's partner organizations, and I helped Sharice and Mike on the research for the PIC section, which I really enjoyed. The PIC is a very complex beast. I guess from a structural perspective, it might be worth me just outlining very briefly why I say that. The PIC is the largest asset manager in Africa, as Sharice said, almost 3 trillion rand. And it's unique because it effectively forms the purpose of a sovereign wealth fund without being defined as such. There are sovereign wealth funds that you might have heard of in Europe and the Middle East, like Norges or the PIF, and those are famous for various reasons. But the thing that makes the PIC unique in contrast is that those funds are used to benefit their countries from a strategic perspective by investing in the passive capital, like Mike is saying, but not necessarily having to still provide for pensioners, because the Norges and PIF money doesn't end up being used by pensioners. It's not managed by those companies on behalf of an organization like the GEPF, which obviously is supposed to be looking after not only the country, but also those employees who work so hard for our government. So I guess that's the first thing I wanted to say, and I'll come back to why I think that's important later. The PIC is a universal owner in South Africa, and that's a financial term, and I think Sharice said this earlier, that it owns a large portion of the JSE. I think the number's around 13% of the JSE, which is a huge amount. And in fairness to the PIC, I'm not going to defend them, but they don't have a choice in this because South Africa is a small market. The JSE is not a huge market. It's only got about 100 companies in it. And there's numerous liquidity constraints that come with being a 3 trillion rand asset manager in the African context. So they do have to be a large owner in the JSE. They don't have a lot of choice in that. So I guess to answer the first part of your question, do they have a choice to invest in companies like Sasol, Exxaro, Glencore, Thungela? No, they don't. That doesn't mean that they don't have a role in making those companies better for South Africans, both in the present and the future. And because they're a universal owner, so universal owner basically means that they're inextricably tied to how the South African market performs, both privately in the JSE and otherwise. Because if the JSE does well, that's usually an indication that the country's doing well. You can see that last year, which was the best year for the JSE in kind of 25 years, and that's partly because the sentiment around South Africa was improving quite drastically, even though there's lots of issues still. And because they're a universal owner, they also own, as you mentioned, lots of South Africa's fossil fuel companies, which are a hugely important part of our economy as it stands. Not that they should be, or I support that, but having a coal and oil set of companies in the JSE has always been a critical part of that market. And because they are structurally tied into those companies without making changes, like Charisse was mentioning, to how those companies make money by putting pressure on them through shareholder activism, they undoubtedly end up creating this vicious cycle where they continue to support and subsidize the production of fossil fuels in South Africa simply by not being good enough at their job of engaging with those companies. They've never voted against Sasol's climate policy, was one of the things that I found out, which was very interesting. So why is this a problem? This comes more to fossil fuels as an issue, and I don't really have time to do that whole just energy transition and the problem of fossil fuels justice. But fossil fuels are the largest contributor to climate change in both South Africa and the world. I think it's 75% of global emissions are created by fossil fuel production, but also to huge direct and indirect social challenges in South Africa and globally, including health, unemployment, all sorts of social challenges. For example, Center for Environmental Rights and Groundwork, I have an estimate here of over 2,000 deaths from coal pollution per year in South Africa alone. That's a pretty crazy number. And those are just the direct measurable impacts, and fossil fuels have an enormous impact across the spectrum. It also makes electricity more expensive and takes away money that could be spent on important aid, and instead gives it to fossil fuel companies as subsidies. I guess hopefully that gives an outline to why I think it's important to talk about the PIC and fossil fuels. And this is where I'll tie it back into what I was mentioning at the beginning, and what can we do? And because the PIC manages money on behalf of pensioners, this gives the pensioners whose money they hold a unique piece of power, I guess. I don't love the word power necessarily, but it means that those who are beneficiaries of the GEPF in particular can go to their trustees, hopefully, and say, we don't want our money invested in companies that are doing things like Daybreak Farms are doing, for instance. They can't tell them not to invest in Sasol, but they can tell them to be more actively engaged, positive shareholders in Sasol. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think that was a very important, contribution to the discussion. I mean, it's very complicated, but for myself, I say, sort of understand the complexities, that the PIC is confronted with. Also its relationship as well into the just energy transition as well. Thank you so much for that contribution. I'm just going to pose one last question to the panel, and then we will open up the floor for Q&A. So just get ready with those. Mike, some individuals feature prominently. You know, it's the same person. It's the same person at PIC. You know, I mean, even with the other WOSAs, it's sometimes the same individuals. I'm not going to name names, but you know, there's that. They feature as well in funding political parties. So you can understand that's also another territory, you know, of political control and the economy essentially. They also feature in state capture, you know, those same individuals. You know, but for this one, for this report in particular, how does the ownership in the pension sector overlap with political power and influence? What did you come up with?
You keep saying you're not going to name names, but you can name names. That's how we work. And in fact, I was going to say, I mean, there's a reason actually that we put everyone's face on the front cover, right? Because, I mean, I think so many of these individuals, immensely powerful, but often kind of too far behind the scenes. So I think, you know, that's the principle. Yeah. But yeah, to your question about the kind of political overlap, I think it comes through in a couple of different ways. The one is about ownership, and the other one is more directly about day-to-day governance at these companies. I mean, from an ownership perspective, the name that comes up, that really comes up across the series so far is Patrice Motsepe, right?
I did not want to,
But
yeah, I was alluding.
You don't want to name his name in case he's the next president. He keeps saying he's not going to run. That doth protest too much. But I mean, if you look at this, is another kind of interesting example. So he's obviously the president's brother-in-law. And Cyril Ramaphosa was long one of the largest holders of Alexander Forbes, through Shanduka before it divested. And now just under 50% of Alex Forbes is owned by African Rainbow Capital, which is, of course, Motsepe's firm. It's also one of the, I think just after the PIC, one of the largest shareholders in Sanlam as well. And through that, it has extraordinary kind of influence and ownership throughout the financial economy, because Sanlam owns kind of so many other companies. So, I mean, I think that's one example. But I think what might be even kind of more important, because I think it links so closely to what Sydney was talking about earlier, is that if you look at the crisis of unpaid benefits and what you need to do to address it, you need a regulator that is not in the pocket of the companies. And one of the problems that we have in the financial sector, and we speak about it in the very first volume of Who in South Africa, is this revolving door between regulatory bodies, the state, and the private sector. And there are some really interesting examples of this. There are kind of some high-level ones. You think about someone like Trevor Manuel, former finance minister, who then goes on to be the chair of the board of Old Mutual for nearly a decade. You know, prior to his death, what something we speak about in the system is how other finance ministers who have gone into the sector. In this report, we speak about Daniel Minele, who's an interesting person. He was the deputy governor of the South African Reserve Bank for a decade. Before he stepped down, went into finance, he then became chair of the board of Alex Forbes. And just before that, President Ramaphosa had asked him to head up the finance team for the Jet Fund. Now, again, there's nothing overt, you know, there's nothing, I'm not suggesting there's anything criminal about this, but I think the problem is when you have people like this who sit and move between the board chairs of these types of companies and to regulatory bodies, they are much more likely to regulate the industry in the interest of the industry rather in the interest of individuals. And this is something that you see not just in pension fund companies, but you see across the board in the financial sector. It's soft touch regulation, and that comes, you know, it comes back to roots. So I think I'll stop there because there's lots to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before opening it up, I don't know if any of the speakers would like to do follow up a little bit on something that I said. I can open it. Want to say something quickly?
Yeah, no, I just want to point out that it has been our experience that there is this tendency amongst big business that it's only them that deserve to keep the money, and anybody else can go, throw themselves in the river. The reason why I'm raising this is there is something that is happening now, and as South Africans, we are quiet about it, and it's an injustice. As we speak now, migrant workers are being pushed out of the country. And as if that is not enough, the employers are giving them packages to go home. And those packages do not match the years they worked for those particular employers. On Monday, I was at a company in Meyerton where about 90 migrant workers were told that their lives, by the employer, that their lives is in danger and they must leave the country, and the employer will give them each 3,000 rand. Now, I'm saying there are laws in this country. If the employer decides to terminate a relationship with an employee, he can either retrench that worker, or if does not retrench that worker, he can either make a reasonable offer, what we call a mutual separation of, genuine. But what we have found in the reports we're collecting from different factories is that the employers are using this opportunity to steal from the migrant workers. You see? Now, why is it in the nature of big business to continue to steal from the poor? Thank you.
Yeah, it's their business model. I think this is a good point for us to stop and reflect and just take some contributions from people who've come tonight. Any questions or comments for the speakers?
Are there any politicians who have taken up this issue? It seems like it could be quite beneficial for somebody's political career to take up this issue.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions at this point? Do you want to take it? Yeah, that have championed. Do you know anyone, Mike?
It's not politicians, but it's something we didn't speak about now, but it's another thing to be worried about. In terms of unpaid benefits, the things that politicians do periodically when times are bad, they want to raid them. They want to say no one's ever going to get this money, so this is going to be a good source of funds to get into. And so one or two, what the state has said is that there are current plans to centralize unpaid benefits into a single unclaimed or unpaid benefits fund. And that's kind of seen, at least by some of the politicians, as the solution to the unpaid benefits problem. That is obviously quite thorny because it depends on who governs that and who gets to make get to make some of those decisions. But that's really, from my experience anyway, politically, where the discussion has tended to focus around.
Yeah, I think the president has mentioned it quite a few times in his sauna. I mean, he mentions a lot of things as well that never materialize. So I don't know if he's the politician, but yeah, I wouldn't say. Maybe. I think there's a question at the back.
Hi, thanks everyone. I was just curious to know, in your estimation, why the pensions are not being paid out. Is it that the pension funds are using small print to not pay out? Or how much of it has to do with the pension fund, the people at the bottom of the chain, not knowing how to navigate this world? Like what are the blocks?
Yeah, no, I think when we picked up this problem, we found that there was a period where the fund administrators were cancelling funds. And they were cancelling funds that had assets in them. Now, in terms of the Pension Funds Act, before you cancel a fund or you liquidate a fund, you need to ensure that that fund no longer has assets. Then you can then cancel it or liquidate it. But we found that there were many funds that were being cancelled without verifying the assets or making sure that those funds, before you cancel them, you've exhausted the process of tracing because what happened here is that in the 80s, or even in the early 90s, take for instance the mining sector. When workers in a mine went on strike, normally what it used to happen is that you will find that after 3 days or a week, the employers will organize buses, and then all those workers will be taken back to their homelands, you see? And they will be told that when the strike is over, you will be brought back. Ne? And what has happened is that over the years, those miners who were on strike, who were taking buses, very few will come back. And then the mining industry will, through TEBA, recruit new mine workers. And as a result, those mine workers who did not return, they could not claim their exit funds from the employers or their UIF or from the Provident Fund. The little money they got in those funds, they could not claim it because they were now pushed to the homelands. Hence, you find there is this number that has been established that there's more than 4 million ex-workers in this country who are owed money sitting in the unclaimed benefits. But if you are sitting with a fund that is generating profit for you as a business entity or business institution or financial institution, and nobody is bothering you about until such time you make a decision, or through a board of trustees, you take a decision to say, we can't allow this money to keep growing in this fashion, because at the end of the day, it's going to create problems for us. We are going to start allocating these profits amongst ourselves as to curb this money ballooning out of control. I'm not saying this as a conspiracy, it's what is happening. Fund administrators are sharing the profits from the unpaid benefit fund to the board of trustees. This is where this money is going for. Two, now the fact that you are asking a question to say, do they just simply decide that they are not going to pay these monies? Look, if they start opening up those unclaimed benefits who are being kept on, what do they call these shelves where they put money? It's going to open a can of worms for them. They may be in trouble. Probably that's why they are pushing back at the UPC to say that you are pushing us to a point where we find ourselves in trouble and the status quo will rather remain. So the stealing continues and they benefit. Fund administrators benefit from unclaimed funds that are sitting there in those accounts that we we cannot access.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, the thing about stealing is that now you're going to need company, and it must be a collective, because now they all have to have the same sort of system to stop people from coming. So they need to speak to each other. Hey, what are you doing for those people not to get money? So to us, it looks like these people are in competition when they are not. There's quite like a lot of collusion that actually happens behind the scenes.
Thanks very much to the panel for the discussion this evening. A large part of the conversation was around regulation, and I'm curious to know, kind of where things stand with the conduct of financial institutions bill, which is, I think it's mentioned in the report. I'm not too sure if I didn't catch it in the discussion, but the kind of political and corporate interests at play in getting that bill to cabinet and everything, and then because we saw a lot of lobbying against NHI and all of that, and so what would the implications of coffee, what would that mean for the sector, and especially in the context of the series as a whole? Yeah.
Do you want to check that on, Mark? Just go to Ivano's question.
I'll take a stab. I think that there's lots to be positive about in terms of the financial sector reforms. So one of them is that for many years in South Africa, every part of the financial sector was governed by different laws. So there was a long-term insurance act, a pension fund act, this act, right? And I think that the kind of bringing some of that together into a single act that looks at the conduct of financial institutions is quite helpful. So I think that that's absolutely a good thing. I think the other thing which is quite helpful is that coffee is part of this new, what they call Twin Peaks financial legislation in South Africa, or regulation, which splits some of the questions about the prudential issues about how much money financial companies need to have, for financial security perspective, from these questions very narrowly about how do you treat people on a day-to-day basis. So I think in that sense, there's a lot that's positive about it. What I would say about coffee, which is concerning, is like so many acts, the politicians were like, yes, it's definitely an important piece of legislation, but it takes forever, right? The process is very slow. And then I think Sydney was talking about it earlier, but for it to be successful, it's going to require the Financial Sector Conduct Authority to have teeth and to really change the nature of the way the regulator has interacted with the companies in the past, and want to be more, energetic, let's say, in holding the companies to account for the way they treat customers, essentially.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you. The PIC seems to be the elephant in the room. I just Googled our national wealth, the total value of the whole South Africa, if you had to ascertain it, is about thrice the size of the PIC that Google says 22 million. Our GDP is about 22 trillion. Our GDP is 8 trillion. So the PIC 7 trillion is pretty close, owns a third of the whole of South Africa. Is a very, very powerful entity. What is its mandate? How is it constituted? And is there, to use this term, is there a way to decolonize it? If that's the correct term. Thanks.
That's an important question. Chief, do you want to take a stab at it? I mean, essentially, I know they're the public bank holding everyone's money, and hence you find them everywhere. But I think Michael can give a more formal answer.
I was hoping Charisse was going to take this question. And Togoza, do you want to? And Togoza just give me a thumbs up. He's like, no, it's fine. Look, I think, and Sam obviously could speak to this as well. And Sam, if you want to come in after me. But I think there's a couple of things that come up. In the chapter, the one thing is, did we learn anything from the Mpati Commission of Inquiry? Because that Commission of Inquiry, like Charisse was saying, I mean, that's less than 10 years old. And it essentially found that the PIC was being used as a piggy bank, right? I mean, at that point, senior people in the PIC were directly trading financial favors to get money back into companies. And I mean, Sam spoke about this, but the PIC as this universal owner is always going to hold these huge stakes in public companies, but the unlisted stuff is where all the shenanigans kind of take place. And I mean, there's a current crisis in leadership, and I think what it shows is that they haven't enacted the reforms properly from the Empathy Commission, because we still kind of have these scandals. But I mean, the second part of your question, which I think Sam was speaking about, and it goes maybe to what you're saying, is that the PIC could be a force, but it just doesn't throw its weight around. It's enormous. As you say, it's hugely powerful. I mean, the example Sam gave, I think, is a fascinating example. It's not once ever in its history said to Sasol, I'm actually not happy with your decarbonization plans, right? It's also the largest shareholder in all of these companies, and yet it doesn't go to those, it doesn't exercise that ownership to bring to bear other parts of its mandate. I mean, I don't want to go into the weeds of what's happening right now, but I mean, it's obviously also interesting that our finance minister and deputy finance minister are on opposite ends of a very public war about what the governance crisis is there. Sharice, you want to add?
I think there needs to be tighter oversight mechanisms in place, because like obviously they're going to say we have implemented all of the recommendations, but they really haven't. So it's a lie. I don't know if Sam has any insights.
Before I bring Sam in, I was just going to say, when you were speaking about the scandals, I realized he's hopeful because you don't know the mess that's in there. There's really it's not looking good. I think so. Maybe you can speak quickly about like the mandate of the PIC. I mean, I understand it to be asset manager of public funds, and like everyone's money is there, but like what are they doing with the money?
Yeah, so they're governed by the PIC Act of 2004. To very simply answer your second part, I don't think there's any way to really break down their power. I just don't see it happening, unfortunately. The one interesting thing that I did find out is that part of their trustees of the GEPF, who are the ones who determine the investment policy and investment mandate that they give the PIC, are some of the biggest trade unions in South Africa. So COSATU, SATU are both part of the board of the GEPF, which I find very interesting. So that, I guess that's the only way really, is to get the people who are the beneficiaries of the GEPF. If there are anyone here, please feel free to speak to me or Open Secrets, to be more involved as pensioners who need to care about where their money's going.
Thank you so much, Sam. There's a question from an online audience before we go to the back. Who is responsible for holding these pension companies to account? As citizens of this country, we have lost billions, if not trillions, by way of not holding them to account. How do we hold them account? I mean, there's a regulatory body. I don't know if the experience has changed from, it was the FSB and then it became the FSCA. So, like, how do we hold them account? You wanna go?
Yeah, no, I think we as worker activists and activists in general, we need to hold the FSCA to account, because the FSCA is supposed to hold the fund administrators to account, but they are not doing their job. So we need to check with the FSCA, what is the purpose, therefore, that they exist. Otherwise, we need to see action in terms of, because as the UPC, we have been in a relationship with the FSCA for more than 3 years. Ne? And we were saying to the FSCA, look, it's important that you explain the processes that are happening at the FSCA so that we can engage at an equal footing. but you'll find that the FSCA sends, correspondence or information maybe twice in a month to the UPC, and they're saying, we have decided to exempt these following pension funds for following guidelines in the Pension Fund Act of 90. Now, what you find is that some of the employers will, or some of the fund administrators will say, we are going to liquidate these 50 pension funds, and we want you as the FSCA to exempt us from following the rules in the Pension Fund Act in terms of cancelling these funds. And the information that comes to us as the UPC is that, take note that the FSCA has now taken a decision to exempt these funds from following the Act in terms of cancellation or liquidation. Now we are saying, look, we are not engaging on the same footing here, because what we would have expected is that the FSCA has received the request from the fund administrator to cancel these following funds. Therefore, as the UPC, do you have any input to make in terms of this request, so that we are given a chance as well to look into these funds and look if these funds have got assets, or look into, which is something that we do not have capacity for, but we think that including society and working together collectively, it's something that as activists we can be able to respond to. So I'm just saying that I think it's important that maybe we take or we hold the FSCA to account.
Yeah, I think I got that sense as you were speaking, because it seems like the legislation is helpful. You cannot take out money without informing the pension fund members, and then there's the regulatory body, which is the FSCA. So it seems that the problem might be, the one that's responsible for regulation.
And the UPC is a stakeholder in this whole arrangement. We can't be ignored.
Yeah. There was a hand at the back. Oh, yeah, and then.
So I can go?
Yeah, you can go, and then.
Okay, I'm Bevel Lucas. For most of my life, I spent in the trade union movement. And the complacency that has crept into the organized labor presents a real challenge for us. The association of the asset managers that has associated with the labor movement as a cash cow is part of the challenge that we have. I think one of the things that happened in the 1980s, when what was then referred to NUMSA's predecessor, MAU, Metal Allied Workers Union, when they fought for the right to belong to the bargaining council, that is when things started to change. And MAU also started to change once it got into the bargaining council. So there are transitional stuff that has impacted as to how, in particularly organized labor, has lost its voice in this particular matter. And the UCB is fortunate that we have such an institution that needs to be elevated for the work that it is trying to do. Just to share a very short story, there's a big multinational hotel in the city of Cape Town that had brought migrant workers to Cape Town and was able to then, under the apartheid state, get them colored identities in Cape Town as a means to comply with the Colored Preference Act. So this issue of accountability goes way back. And what has happened to those workers who were given new identities in post-apartheid South Africa when they wanted to claim their benefits under the previous identity. So there were a whole lot of collusion that had happened under apartheid between the employers and the apartheid state as well.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to take the last two hands, and then we do I had closed.
Thank you so much. It's respectful to stand. So my name is Gerabitsi, and I have just two to three offerings. One connected to the point that the gentleman just made, and one back to the PIC, which I think is very critical. Maybe Sam can help me later because it's unnerving me. But actually, I think one of the problems we're seeing now in post-apartheid South Africa is that the political system is not really working. Not because as a result of maybe the leaders themselves, but it's a question also of the space and the processes that are in fact I think have been problematic since 1994. After politician, we're experiencing similar things, and so that's really I think crippling our democracy overall. And it should also be a question of how the spaces are in fact designed. Do they really aid? Are they in fact of any benefit for the marginalized? And that's really back to the point on maybe decolonization to an extent. But on the PIC, a big issue that's also going to really creep in around climate financing, around corporates and ESCOM, is the issue of water in Mpumalanga, right? And what's happening in the municipalities around that area that are in debt, that are crippled, and that are crumbling. And communities are affected by a water crisis in what is also about to become a heating crisis in the country from a climate perspective. So I'm just really wondering that how does the PIC then look at these, state functions such as the municipality being crippled by a debt to ESCOM, debt to water service providers, and so on and so forth, that now it's just these so-called towns that are creating, that are benefiting the country in terms of GDP are also becoming ghost towns, and the people in those localities are not benefiting directly. And then the last point I have to make is that to the gentleman at the back on do the people not know that the pension funds need to be paid out? Is there something intrinsically wrong with the process? I think absolutely yes, there's something intrinsically wrong with the process, because even majority of the people now don't really know how pension funds work. There's also now pension fund taxation that people didn't know were in fact in place. So I think there's just inherently the system is not working for the people that are meant to benefit, and it seems to be in turn benefiting itself with the monies that are on the shelf, as Ubaba said. So then there's a need to actually rethink how these processes work. There's a need to actually be more inclusive, and if we don't deconstruct this very process, then it's never really going to benefit the people that matter.
Thank you so much. The last hand, quickly.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at your edition here. My name is Mandisa, and I'm just looking at your edition here, volume 4, and it says Power and Profit, Truth and Justice. And thank you very much for the truth that has been divulged tonight. But what are we going to do about the justice? Is this edition going to feature in the Sunday Times? First page, or at least the conclusion on page 36. Is it going to feature in the Sunday Times, Business Day, Cape Times, and let the public know? Because I think the public will do something about it. Or what is going to happen? How are we going to get the justice? I mean, this is just mind-boggling. It cannot continue.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure you mentioned those because it's your preference, but we are we are going to be in the media. We're going to do a few radio interviews, Power FM, SAFM, and then we're going to have a segment on Newsroom Africa on Sunday. What time, Mike? Sorry, Saturday. Yeah, so please look out for that. Unfortunately, we really need to wrap up. There's an audience online that we need to let go also. Quick sticks, 30 seconds. Do you want to add anything before I close, or we can just talk as we leave? Quickly.
Are we allowed a 30-second wrap up?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. So maybe just, two thoughts. The one is I just wanted to respond to that. I think what you've said there is so important. It's this idea of, can we have some kind of coherence of the direction, right? If the PIC is a 3 trillion rand organization, and it's governed by the people who are in the finance ministry and in senior levels of government. Why can't we have more coherence about how that money is spent and what it's in pursuit of, right? It shouldn't be so difficult. I think that's the one. And then the other one is just to say, I really think that, this discussion, we need to reclaim pension funds for the pension funds and take them and increasingly separate them out from the administrators. Like pension fund trustees, whether it's the GPF or some of the other pension funds, they need to really be empowered to understand what their obligations are and what their powers are, to repurpose the pension fund and build that divide between not just allowing it to be the purview of the financial corporations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, mine is to say that it's very much painful that you've got so many people out there knocking at the doors of the fund administrators for them to access maybe their late husband's death benefits or provident fund. And as society, we are not doing anything to assist those people. So I'm just asking that wherever you come from, just check if there's a branch of the UPC there and support that branch, please.
Sharice?
Brief thought is that power, it definitely does come from the ground up. I think trade unions do play a significant part and can hold them accountable through that way. But also the PIC did say something about adopting an ESG framework, and like that can be a way to also hold them accountable, and maybe even a step towards getting them to commit to a binding policy to the just transition.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues, for your contribution and for the lovely report that you guys have put together. Through the powers invested in me as chair, you can speak to Sam as a follow-up. Just to say thank you so much, everyone, for spending the evening with us. We really appreciate it. This is an ongoing series, so we're going to have another one possibly in October. So do look out on our socials for information on that. Just deep appreciation for everyone for making the time. I'm going to close it. Thank you so much. There's refreshments outside, and please, the survey form is very important. Megan would be upset with me if you don't fill it. Thank you so much, and also thank you to the Open Secrets team as well for putting this event together. Thank you.